You know, there's a phrase that I have always wanted to say but I've never been able to use it. I love sports. I love competition, if you know me at all. And I wish at some point in my life, in the different sports that I've been a part of, I wish I would have been able to say these two words: I'm him. I'm him. You know, when I was in elementary school, there's a moment where maybe I thought I was him. And then you got to junior high, and you're like, I'm not sure I'm him. And then as soon as you're in junior high, you're like, I'm him. You know, you're playing basketball, I'm like, I'm him. Then you get to senior high, and you're like, I'm not sure I'm him. For some of you, you were him in senior high, and then you got to college, you're like, I'm not him. And we get this idea at some point in our lives that maybe you're him, or maybe you're her. And then you meet somebody who's better at that thing than you, and you're like, I'm not him, and I'm not her. There's a very few people in this world that elevate to the level on a global scale of being able to say, I'm him. I'm the GOAT. I'm the greatest of all time. Or I'm her. There were almost just under a year ago, my son and I was dropping him off at school at Cape and Ray, and there was this, one of the sports that I love following is mountain biking and cross-country mountain biking. There is a guy who is him, the GOAT. And his name is Nino. Everybody say Nino. Most of you guys never said that name before, but Nino. Nino's from Switzerland. Nino's won 10 world championships. He's won over 30 World Cup races. He's a 3-time Olympic medalist. He is him. He's the greatest of all time in the world of cross-country mountain biking. And so we were going over to Austria, drop my son off, and I said it was Nino's last year of racing, and the last World Cup championship race was in Switzerland, his home country. And I said to Joel, I was like, there's a chance that we could take a little detour, go to Switzerland, watch him race his final championship race in his home country. You want to do that? He was like, oh yeah. And so we took a train to the middle of Switzerland, and we got to see Nino on his very last World Cup championship race. The GOAT, him. That's him right there, and that's him right there. Taking the jump right past me, and that's me with him. That's me. That's me, and that's him. And so no matter what sport you're following, usually there comes this kind of conversation of like, who's the GOAT? Like, who's the greatest of all time? And in some sports, it's like really, really clear. Like Wayne Gretzky, the GOAT, right? MJ, obviously, the GOAT. He's him. There's no debate. You can debate me after, but there isn't. Serena Williams, tennis. You know, I'm him. She's her. He's him. That is not a new idea. In fact, the very first person to say, I'm him, was God himself. I don't know if you knew that. But God was the first one to say, I'm him. And Jesus shows up on the scene in John chapter 8, and he has this encounter that brings this whole idea to an apex. And just like we often debate and have conflict and arguments over, who's the GOAT, who's him, like who's the greatest of all time, Jesus introduced a new name into the conversation, and it results in a little bit of conflict and argument itself in John chapter 8. And so John 8 begins by saying, to the Jews who had believed in him. And so remember, Jesus was being followed by a bunch of people who were encapsulated by him. He was doing signs, miracles, wonders. They're like, this guy's amazing. And so these are people that were inclined to believe in him, were inclined to follow him. Their hearts were for him. And Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And they thought, when they heard him say it, they're like, that's an odd thing to say. What do you mean set free? He's like, we're sons of Abraham. And so this whole conversation starts to take place. We're sons of Abraham. We've never been slaves to anyone. Well, we know that's not true. They were slaves to many countries, but they're like, Abraham's the best. Like, he's our father, and God called him specifically, and we're his descendants. And because we're his descendants, it means something about us. That we're not captives to anyone. Abraham is our father. And Jesus said, well, if Abraham's your father, you would do what Abraham did. You would do what he did, but you're not. And in fact, you're looking for a way to kill me. And then they're like, what is he saying? And then Jesus says this, your father isn't Abraham, your father's the devil. Well, Jesus holds no punches. And so they're getting offended. He says, your father's the devil because the devil is a murderer. He's been a murderer from the beginning and he's a liar. And you're more like the devil than you are like Abraham. And they're like, we're not the devil. And then they start arguing back. And I was like, you're demon possessed. That's what the deal is. And Jesus says, I'm not demon possessed. The one who obeys me will never taste death. And at this, they just lost their minds. Like, what do you mean never taste death? You know, Abraham was the greatest of all time. He was the greatest, and even he tasted death. And are you saying that you're greater than Abraham? Are you a bigger deal than Abraham? And then Jesus says this. They said, are you greater than Abraham? He died, and so did the prophets. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. They said, who do you think you are? Which is a great question. Every single one of us should ask that question. Jesus, who do you think you are? Every single one of us should ask the question, who do we think Jesus is? Who is Jesus? But we should also ask the question, who does Jesus think he is? Who does Jesus claim that he is? So Jesus, who do you think you are? And then Jesus replied, I glorify myself. My glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him and obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. And they said, you are not yet 50 years old, they said to him, and you have seen Abraham? You're not even old enough to get the seniors discount at Denny's. And you think that you've seen Abraham? So then Jesus replies, very truly I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. And at this, they picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus hid himself slipping away from the temple grounds. And so they wanted to stone him, so they pick up stones. And because Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And that's really bad grammar. I mean, like stoning someone that's a harsh consequence for bad grammar. Right? My wife's a stickler for bad grammar. I'm sure there's multiple times she's like, don't, it's not that there, it's the other there. They wanted to stone him. Now, what was Jesus saying? If Jesus was saying, before Abraham existed, I existed. In the beginning of time, I was there. John has already told us this in other places in his gospel already, that Jesus was there at the beginning. If Jesus simply wanted to say, I have always existed, that I was older than Abraham, he would say, before Abraham was, I was. He would be consistent in his verbiage. Before Abraham was, past tense, I was, past tense. I existed before him, but Jesus doesn't say that. He says, before Abraham was, I am. And they pick up stones to stone him. Why did they want to stone him? And it's not because they didn't understand what he's saying. They wanted to stone him because they understood exactly what he was saying. When Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, he's saying, I'm him. I'm him. I'm the goat. Now, if we really want to understand why this was so offensive to the people that were following Jesus, we have to go back to the Exodus story. And you'll notice a theme here as we go through the book of John, that John loves to help us understand what God is doing, who God is, what Jesus is up to, by bringing these themes from the Exodus story in the Old Testament to the time of Jesus. And the Exodus story was one where God heard the cries of his people, where he came to rescue them and take them from slavery into freedom. And so that metaphor kind of serves as a backdrop to the gospel story, where John and the other gospel writers are saying there's a God who sees you, who hears you, and he's come to rescue you and take you from slavery into freedom. And so the slaves were, the Israelites were slaves for 400 years in Egypt, and they were called to be God's special people, to be special representatives on earth in history. And after 4 centuries of being slaves, you can imagine themselves wondering what that promise was about, what that declaration of being a certain people who God had a certain purpose and plan for their lives. And they're like, what is going on? We're slaves. This has been 400 years. God was lying, or maybe we heard something wrong. And so they're complaining, they're questioning, they're wondering. And so after 400 years of slavery, it says in Exodus 2, the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. And so in the Old Testament, when you were reading the scriptures and it's talking about God, who is it talking about? Well, the Hebrew term is Elohim. Everybody say Elohim. And so Elohim in Hebrew simply translates as God, and it's a generic title referring to a deity. So in the same ways that we would use God in our culture, it's the exact same idea in Hebrew. And so when you're talking about God, people would maybe think, well, which God are you talking about? Are you talking about the Jewish God, the Christian God, the Muslim God, the Hindu God, your own God? Like we use the concept of God in all sorts of ways to describe something divine that we believe to be true. And so the Bible begins in Genesis 1, in the beginning was God, in the beginning was Elohim, and he created everything. And so the Bible introduces this concept of God, that there's this divine being, this general divine being that has some characteristics. And as the Bible story goes on, you learn about who this God is and what he's like. And then you get to the 10 Commandments and different things where God starts to articulate some things of who he is, how you ought to live. And he says, I am the Lord, your Elohim. You shouldn't have any other Elohim, any other gods before me. So God's saying, like, I'm the God. I should be the central God of your life. And they're starting to learn something about this Elohim that is different than maybe other Elohims. And so Moses has a general idea of who Elohim is, of who this God is. And he has a general idea of who this God is because he's heard stories about this God. He's had a couple of different experiences where he's encountered this divine presence. And he knows that his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, had some encounters with this divine presence as well. And so he is a shepherd for his father-in-law at this point in Exodus. And he grew up in Egypt. He grew up in royalty. And he escaped because he murdered an Egyptian. And so he was already there. His people were there as slaves, but he wasn't a slave. And he murdered an Egyptian, and he ran away. And so he ran away because he was a criminal, because he was afraid what would happen to him because he was a murderer, but he also ran away because his own people rejected him. He was a traitor. I mean, they were slaves, and he was growing up in the courts of Pharaoh, enjoying the good life in Egypt. And so the Egyptians didn't like him. His own people didn't like him. And so he ran away into the wilderness, spent 40 years in the wilderness, became a shepherd. And so he'd been minding his own business, shepherding these sheep, doing his thing for his father-in-law, and he is out in the wilderness with these sheep, and he comes to Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, and he has this unique encounter with what he understands to be a divine presence. And so he sees a bush, and the bush is burning, and you think that's somewhat normal, but then it turns into an abnormal scene because the bush isn't burning up, and so this bush is on fire, but it's not burning up. It just keeps flaming, and it's like, what is happening? It's a strange sight, and it's getting stranger the longer he watches it. So he goes towards the burning bush, and as he's coming towards this sight, this burning bush, he hears a voice that says, do not come closer, Elohim said. Take off your sandals, for the place you're standing is holy ground. And so Moses, as he's coming towards this bush, hears this voice. The voice says, take off your sandals. because this ground is holy. Now, holiness doesn't just mean like this morally uptight idea. Holiness means sacred. It means set apart. It means unique and different. This voice, this Elohim voice speaks to Moses that the place that you're standing is sacred. It's set apart. It's a different kind of place than where you came from. And you should take off your shoes. You know, Moses being a shepherd, he's walked through who knows what. He's got all sorts of stuff on his sandals, on his shoes. And so he's coming towards this bush and God says, take them off. I grew up in a farming community, and in a farming community, there's a lot of farmers, and they're out doing their farming thing. They're farming the fields. They got cattle. You know, I had a grandpa that farmed fields. He worked with cattle. My uncle took over the farm, and I knew lots of people that had farms. And so you'd be all greasy by the end of the day. You'd be dirty, and you'd have like animal dung and all sorts of things all over you. So you walk in the house, and what does your wife say when you walk in the house? Don't you come in here with those shoes. You know, change your clothes. And in fact, in the farming houses, they often have these things called mud rooms at the entrance. And it's not common here because many of us aren't farmers. But you go to a farming house, there's a mud room, and there's often a bathroom right at the entrance, this back entrance. There might be a shower in that back entrance. Why? Because you come in the house, you got to take off your shoes, you got to strip down, you take a shower because you got all this stuff on you, and you're entering a different kind of place, a different kind of space. You were out in the farm, out in the dirtiness, and now you're going to come into your wife's domain or mom's domain. And it's like, this is a different kind of space. You got to clean up before you get in here, right? So this is the same type of idea. Moses, you know, he's a shepherd. He's dirty. He's got all sorts of stuff on his shoes, and he's coming towards this new kind of space and place, and God says, take off those shoes. The place you're standing is holy. It's sacred. It's different. It's set apart. Why? Because I'm divine. This voice is divine. This flame you see, it's the presence of God. And even though Moses and others at that time maybe didn't understand fully who God was or what he was all about, they understood that God was holy and set apart, and you just couldn't flippantly come into his presence. And so Moses takes off his sandals. And so for Moses, these sandals, they represented for him his life, his story, his occupation. They represented where he had been. You know, there's a similar scene in Joshua where Joshua comes before the angel of the Lord, and the Lord and he hears the voice say to him, take off your sandals. The place where you're standing is holy. And he has to take off his sandals, and he has to surrender. This is an act of surrendering. And so, who am I talking about? Joshua. So many J's. Joshua has to surrender before he goes and has victory. And so you see this idea in Scripture, taking off your sandals. It represents who you are. It represents your identity. It represents your career. It represents your journey. I don't know your story, but you all have some sense of identity of who you are. You all have a journey of places you've been. Some of those things you're really proud of. Some of them are successful, and you would love to brag about your successes. Some of you had failures, things that you would like to forget. We've all walked a long ways in our shoes. But when Moses, they come into the presence of God, God says, take off your shoes, take off your sandals. What is this saying? In some way, it's like, take off the thing that you think defines you. And some of you, it's like, take off your failure. Leave your failure. And some of you think, I don't know if I can leave my failure. They're a part of who I am. I can't take off my shoes. This is me. God says, leave it behind. Leave your successes. So if you're like, I can't leave my success. This is like my identity. This is who I am. God says, you're coming into a different kind of space. Leave that behind. God even says, leave your sexuality. You're like, well, this is part of who I am. This is like how I identify myself. It's like, this is a different kind of space. You got to leave it behind. These are my talents. These are my gifts. These are like whatever the thing is, like everything that you might identify with you, that's metaphorically what you're walking in and what you're walking from. Moses comes towards the burning bush. God says, take them off. And that's why for some people, when they come into the presence of God, it's a beautiful thing. It's like, you mean I don't have to live with my failure anymore? And it's beautiful and it's life-giving. But it's also why it's super painful for some people. You mean to come into the presence of the Lord, I have to actually get rid of the things that I think are a part of me, that I'm proud of, that I want to cling to? And so that burning bush experience, it's like, it can be beautiful and it can be painful. But God says to Moses, to Joshua, take off your shoes. And so Moses recognized that he's in a special place, a unique place, a divine space. And he takes off his sandals. And then God has a conversation with him. It says, then he said, I am the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at Elohim. And so Elohim, again, is a generic word for God. And so it could mean multiple things. Like, my name is Matt. It's a great name, I think. But it's a little bit of a common name. Like, how many Matts? We got any Matts in the room? We got a Matt. Any other Matts? You got a Matt there. I know there's a Matt in the back studio. So we got at least 4 Matts in this room. And so if I said Matt, you're like, you could say, which Matt? And just stick with me. You can say, well, the Matt over there. But let's say you can just point to one of the Matts. You'd have to say, and you couldn't use his last name. You'd say, well, the Matt who, is married to Lisa. The Matt who has 3 boys. The Matt who, is a pastor at that church, that Sunwest Church. And the Matt who has done this or is this. And so you would start to describe that person based on their story, on their relationships, on their past, or you start to add information, and that tells you the identity somewhat of the person that you're talking about. And so this Elohim, this divine presence that is showing up to Moses, God is trying to help Moses understand which Elohim this is. Like, I'm the Elohim. I'm not just this one time. I've been around before. I was the Elohim of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob. And so I was like, okay, like he's coming to an understanding of who this Elohim is. And then it says, the Lord said, which we're going to come back to that title in a second. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard him crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, and Mennonites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I? Like, they think I'm a murderer. Who am I? My people think I'm a traitor. Who am I? I'm a stutterer. I can't even speak very well. This is one of Moses' struggles with himself. Is like, I'm not even a good speaker. So Moses is like, God, I'm not him. Which, by the way, is exactly why Moses was able to be used by him. Moses says, I'm not him. And God says, I will be with you. This will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God back here on this mountain. So Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the Elohim of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? Elohim said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. Now just stick with me here for a second. In the Hebrew, I am who I am is from the word Ehyeh. Everyone say Ehyeh. Now, over time, words change, and this is no different in the Hebrew. It was eventually pronounced with a W, Yahweh. Everybody say Yahweh. That's a fun word to say, hey? So Yahweh means I am. It's the first person singular of the verb to be. I am who I am. Whatever it is that I am that thing. You're like, that's confusing. I am existence. I am self-existence. I am uncreated. I am non-contingent. I am the source of life and existence itself. Before anything existed, I was and I am. I am life. So Elohim also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. So the Lord, the Elohim of your fathers. And so the word Lord in the Hebrew is Yahweh. And so Moses says, who should I tell them that sent me? And he says, Yahweh, I am. And then it says Yahweh. Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers. So very simply, we're good Canadian here, we get that, I. Yah means he. And so this is in verb form. We have Yahweh, first person singular, I am. Yahweh, third person singular, he is. So literally when Moses is like, God, who should I tell them, sent me? What is the name? He's him. That's what Yahweh means. He's him. Quite literally. So before that came a trendy phase in modern culture, it was, Moses encountered the first, he's him. And so every time you're reading through your Old Testament, you will see in capitalized letters, the Lord. Why do you have that word in your Bible in capitalized letters? Lord in Hebrew is Adonai, but that is used in place of Yahweh. And so the Israelites understood that this name was sacred. You shouldn't even speak this name. It was so sacred that they wouldn't even write it down. And so when we translate Yahweh, we translate it to the Lord in your Bible. And so when you read the Lord your God, we just think the Lord your God, the Lord your God. It's like this is a sacred identification from God to us saying, Yahweh, your Elohim. The Lord, the great I am, he's him. And this term Yahweh happens in your Old Testament Bibles over 5,400 times. It's God's self-identification of who he is. And so they didn't speak the name. Well, when they're translating out of the Hebrew, they didn't write the name. It was so sacred. And so we write the Lord, or they wrote Adonai. But even though that they couldn't speak it, the Hebrew, when you're writing Hebrew, you have the consonants, the vowels aren't written down. And so you have Yod, He, Ve, He, your Y, H, W, and H. And so some rabbis, even though they shouldn't say the name, even though they wouldn't write the name, there was this thought that these letters themselves sounded like breathing. Yod, He, Vod, He. Yod, He, Vod, He. Yod, He, Vod, He. And so some rabbis believed that even though we couldn't speak the name, you can't live without speaking the name. The very name of God is life itself. In fact, when a baby comes into this earth, it doesn't live until it takes its first breath, or you could think it doesn't live until it speaks the name of God for itself. When we leave this earth, we can think, well, we don't die until we stop breathing. Or you could think we don't die until we stop being able to speak the name of God. The name of God is life, existence, breath itself. And so Moses has this encounter with God, and Moses is like, who are you? And God says, I am existence. I am. Before anything, I was, and I am. I'm the source of life. I am the thing that sustains. I am the uncreated one. And so 1,500 years after Moses has this encounter with God in front of this burning bush, a carpenter shows up, this rabbi type figure that people were really intrigued by. And in John 8, it's very clear that the people that were listening to him in John 8 were people that believed in him. They were people that were inclined to trust him, to think that what he said was wise, was smart, that he knew what he was talking about, that he was giving some teaching and wisdom that was different than anything they had heard before. And so they were kind of with him for a little bit until he said this. Very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. Yahweh. And when he said that, they picked up stones and wanted to stone him. Why? Because just because Jesus says Yahweh doesn't mean that they would say Yahweh. Just because Jesus says I am doesn't mean that they should say he is. He's him. And so Jesus declared who he was, but they had to make a decision whether they believed that Jesus was who he said he was or he wasn't. And so they decided that this was too much. This was too far. And they pick up stones and they want to kill him. You know, many people are intrigued by Jesus and they think that Jesus is a great teacher, that there's lots of wisdom there, that he is worth considering in the marketplace of ideas. You know, C.S. Lewis is famous for pointing this out, but C.S. Lewis basically says, you can't do that. If you think that, you've clearly never read the Bible, you clearly haven't heard what Jesus is saying. Jesus, in some ways, makes you and forces you to make a decision. Jesus is egocentric in everything that he's teaching and saying. The claims of his teachings are egocentric. And so Lewis's point was like, you can't actually just say Jesus is a good teacher, that there's lots of wisdom. If you actually listen to what he's saying, you got to come to the conclusion that he's lying to you, or that he's a lunatic, that he's a little crazy, or that he is who he says he is. And this is why in John 8, they want to stone him. This is why in John 8, they go from believing in him to saying, you're a demon. Jesus says, I'm not a demon. I am. And so what do you do with that? Jesus basically brings you to a point of saying, you got to crown me or kill me. You got to believe who I said I am, or you're going to stone me to death. Because when you listen to the teachings of Jesus, Jesus was so egocentric that he said, I'm him. Not just in some sports arena, not just in some category where we argue about who's the GOAT in this area, this area. He's like, I'm the GOAT. I'm the greatest of all time in all things. I am God himself. I am life itself. I am existence itself. And here's the fascinating thing when you're trying to figure out what to do with this person, and you're like, do I stone him? Do I crown him? Do I kill him? Like, what am I supposed to do? Jesus' teaching is so egocentric, but his life was so other-centric. This is the fascinating thing about Jesus. He made these tremendous claims about himself, about who he was, and then he says he can forgive sins, which is something that only God can do. It's like, who do you think you are? Remember, that's what they asked him in John 8. Who do you think you are? Great question. Who do you think that you are? And then you think if he was egocentric, if he was narcissistic, he would go the way of every other egocentric, narcissistic leader in history, where he would abuse people, where he'd be a hypocrite, where he would be filled with insecurity, where that egocentricity would just hurt people around him. But you look at the life of Jesus and you realize it's the exact opposite. His claims were so huge on who he thought he was, but the life that he lived was so sacrificial that he gave himself up as a ransom for many. So what do you do with a person like that? What do you do with that? What you do with it, you don't walk away and just say, he said some good stuff. He's a pretty wise guy. I'm going to include him in my marketplace of ideas. It's like, no, you haven't listened to what he's saying. When you hear what Jesus is saying, you have two options. You can pick up stones or you can take off your shoes. That's it. You can pick up stones or you can take off your shoes. You say, that's crazy. I'm going to cut Jesus out of my life. Like, I can't accept that. And so maybe you want to stone him. Or like his disciples, like Moses did, like Joshua did, you can recognize that, okay, I just encountered something that is way different, way more sacred, way more holy, way more beautiful than anything else I've encountered in my whole life. And that in the presence of Jesus, you got to take off your shoes. You got to take off the things that you thought you placed your identity in. You got to take off the things that you thought defined you, the failures, the stuff you walked through. You got to take off the successes that you think, this is who I am. You're saying I got to take off this? Yes, you got to take off that. You got to take off everything that you identify with who you are, whether that's negative or positive, because in the presence of Jesus, it doesn't matter because he is who he is. And when he is who he is and you come before him, it changes who you are because he invites you to come. Nothing else matters. So I'm going to invite you to stand with me if you are able. And as you are standing, I'm going to propose this question to you. When Jesus says, I am who I am, when Jesus says, this is my identity, you have a choice. You either say, he's him, which means Yahweh. He's Yahweh. He's the GOAT. And in fact, when Jesus is saying, when you declare that I am the GOAT, when you give your life to that end, it changes who you are. But when you come to me, take off your shoes. Everything else is secondary. And so I don't know what that means for you this morning. Again, it might mean your failures that are hanging over your head. It might mean your successes that you take pride in. It might mean things about you that you think are so sacred that Jesus is saying those are secondary. But the place you're standing is holy ground. Just pay attention to your breathing for a second. Even before you came to a place of believing who Jesus was, and maybe you're not even there yet, your very existence speaks the name of God. The place you're standing is holy ground. And so the choice is, do you want to stone him or will you take off your shoes? And as we enter into this final song, I would invite you as a response to who Jesus is, who he said he is, that you make everything else in your life secondary and you take off your shoes. The band is going to lead us in the song, and as they move into the song, I invite you to do it, to take off your shoes. You're like, that's going to stink. I'll tell you, it's a beautiful odor to the Lord. When we come before him, we leave everything else behind and say, everything else is secondary because Jesus, you're him.